Dumb tourist thought nobody was looking, but Royal Guard caught him in the act. Jake Morrison had always considered himself the life of the party. Back home in Chicago, his friends called him the show, not because he was particularly talented at anything, but because he could never resist turning every situation into a performance. At 32, he probably should have outgrown his need to be the center of attention, but if anything, social media had only made it worse. "Dude, check this out!" Jake thrust his phone into his friend Mike's face as they walked along the crowded London street. The screen showed yet another viral video of someone trying to make a Royal Guard break character. "These guys are like robots or something. There's gotta be a way to crack them." Mike rolled his eyes, adjusting the strap of his camera. "Leave it alone, man. We're supposed to be seeing the sights, not harassing the guards." But Jake wasn't listening. He hadn't flown across the Atlantic just to be another boring tourist taking selfies in front of Big Ben. Their other friends, Sarah and Tom, trailed behind them, already regretting their decision to let Jake plan part of their London itinerary. They'd known him since college, and that familiar glint in his eye spelled trouble. The same look he'd had before trying to crash a celebrity wedding back in Los Angeles, or when he'd attempted to start a flash mob in Times Square, both incidents that had ended in spectacular failure and moderate humiliation. "I'm telling you," Jake continued, scrolling through more videos on his phone. "All these attempts are amateur hour. People just standing there making faces or dancing? Weak sauce. We need something more dramatic, something that'll really test their training." Sarah quickened her pace to catch up with him. "Jake, seriously, don't. These aren't mall cops, they're actual soldiers. This isn't going to end well." But Jake's mind was already racing with possibilities. He'd spent the entire 8-hour flight watching compilation videos of tourist interactions with the Royal Guards. Each clip had thousands, sometimes millions of views. All he needed was one viral moment, one perfectly executed stunt to put his own social media presence on the map. As they approached the guard post, Jake's excitement grew. 2 guards stood perfectly still, their red uniforms pristine, their black bearskin hats adding an impressive foot to their already intimidating height. Tourist clusters formed semicircles around them, snapping photos and posing for selfies, but maintaining a respectful distance. Jake hung back, observing the scene with the calculated eye of a self-proclaimed prankster. "Here's what I'm thinking," he whispered to his friends, gathering them into a huddle. "Everyone tries to make them laugh or smile, right? But what if someone was hurt? What if they had to choose between maintaining their stance and helping an injured tourist?" "Oh God," Tom groaned, already pulling out his phone to start recording. Not because he approved, but because he knew from experience that Jake's schemes made for excellent blackmail material later. "I'm going to stage the most dramatic fall in tourist history," Jake announced proudly, as if he just solved world hunger. "Right in front of them. Full commitment, we're talking Olympic-level performance here. They'll have to react. It's basic human instinct." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Jake, this is a terrible idea. You're going to get us kicked out, or worse, arrested." "Please," Jake scoffed, shrugging off her concern. "What are they gonna do? They can't move, remember? That's their whole thing. Trust me, I've got this all figured out." His friends exchanged worried glances as Jake began positioning himself, like a sprinter finding his mark. He'd chosen his target, the younger-looking guard on the left, figuring he'd be more likely to break protocol than his more seasoned companion. "Make sure you get my good side," Jake instructed Tom, who reluctantly raised his phone. Sarah covered her eyes, unable to watch, while Mike simply shook his head, already mentally drafting the apology speech they'd probably need later. Jake took a deep breath, channeling every bad acting class he'd ever taken. In his mind, this wasn't just another prank, this was his moment, his shot at internet fame. All those hours of watching viral videos had led to this. He'd show everyone how it was done, become the guy who finally cracked the legendary composure of the Royal Guards. Little did Jake know, his performance was about to get a very different kind of audience than he'd planned for, and his moment of fame would come at a price he hadn't bargained for. As he prepared to launch into his theatrical tumble, The wheels of a much more intricate drama were already in motion, one where he wasn't the director, but rather an unknowing participant in someone else's carefully choreographed show of authority. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the historic courtyard as Jake surveyed his chosen stage. He'd spent the last 20 minutes studying the guards' routine, noting how they maintained their legendary stillness despite the constant stream of tourists snapping photos. The timing had to be perfect. Too many witnesses would ruin the effect, too few would defeat the purpose. "Is everyone recording?" Jake whispered to his friends, his eyes fixed on his target. The two royal guards stood like sentinels carved from stone, their red uniforms blazing in the autumn light, black bearskin hats adding to their imposing presence. Tom reluctantly raised his phone while Sarah and Mike exchanged worried glances, already distancing themselves from what they knew would be another one of Jake's infamous mishaps. Jake took a deep breath, channeling his inner method actor. He'd watched enough viral videos to know that simple silly faces or dancing wouldn't cut it. No, this had to be authentic, something that would force even these professionally stoic guards to break character. His heart raced with anticipation as he positioned himself carefully, calculating the perfect spot for maximum impact. The moment arrived during a brief lull in tourist traffic. Jake launched into action, his body moving with practiced clumsiness. His right foot caught an imaginary obstacle, arms pinwheeling wildly as he stumbled forward. The performance was worthy of a Broadway stage, perhaps a bit too worthy, as several nearby tourists immediately recognized it for the theatrical display it was. Thump! The impact with the centuries-old cobblestones was harder than he'd anticipated. Jake's shoulder connected with the ground, sending a genuine shock of pain through his body. He hadn't factored in the unforgiving nature of stone worn smooth by countless footsteps. Still, this only added authenticity to his performance as he rolled dramatically, clutching his leg. "Oh! My leg!" he cried out, his voice echoing off the historic walls. "Someone help me!" The guards remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed straight ahead, ceremonial rifles held in unwavering parade rest. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement crossed their faces. Around him, the atmosphere shifted as tourists stopped their sightseeing to watch the unfolding drama. Phones emerged from pockets and bags, their cameras now trained on Jake instead of the landmarks. "Is he all right?" a woman whispered in an Australian accent. "Should we call someone?" asked an elderly man, genuine concern in his voice. Nah, he's just pretending," a French tourist explained to his confused children. The murmurs swirled around him like autumn leaves, but Jake remained committed to his performance. He writhed on the ground, adding a few creative groans for good measure. The cobblestones were leaving uncomfortable impressions in his palms, and a small pebble dug into his back, but he persevered. This was his moment, and he wasn't about to let physical discomfort ruin it. Still no reaction from the guards. A kind-faced woman in a green cardigan stepped forward. "Sir, do you need medical assistance?" Jake waved her off, momentarily breaking character before catching himself. "I mean, yes. Oh, the pain. The agony." He clutched his leg more dramatically, shooting pointed looks at the impassive guards. The woman's concern morphed into understanding, then disapproval as she stepped back into the crowd, shaking her head. The guards might as well have been carved from marble. Their discipline was infuriating. Jake had expected at least a flicker of concern, a momentary break in their famous composure. Instead, they continued their unwavering forward stare, as if he were nothing more than another pigeon pecking at crumbs nearby. But Jake wasn't done yet. He'd come too far to give up now. The guards' stubborn professionalism only fueled his determination. If they wouldn't react to a simple fall, he'd have to raise the stakes. As he prepared to launch into the next phase of his impromptu performance, he failed to notice a subtle change in the atmosphere. The crowd's attention had begun to drift, not away from the scene, but towards something behind him. The scattered laughter died in their throats, replaced by a different kind of tension. But Jake, consumed by his own dramatic display, remained oblivious to the new presence that had entered his carefully crafted scene, a presence that was about to turn his performance into something entirely unexpected. Frustration coursed through Jake's veins as his initial performance failed to elicit even a blink from the stoic guards. His shoulders still smarted from the fall, but his wounded pride hurt more. The cobblestones beneath him were cold and unyielding, a stark reminder that his brilliant plan wasn't going quite as smoothly as he'd imagined. Rolling onto his side, he decided to kick things up several notches. If subtlety wouldn't work, he'd go for pure spectacle. "Oh, the agony!" he bellowed, his voice echoing across the courtyard with enough volume to startle a nearby flock of pigeons into flight. "My ankle is absolutely shattered." He writhed on the ground with the dramatic flair of a soccer player trying to draw a penalty, alternating between clutching his right and left ankle, too caught up in his performance to maintain consistency. Tom's hand trembled slightly as he continued filming, his phone capturing every cringe-worthy moment of his friend's escalating foolishness. The screen showed Jake's increasingly theatrical display in perfect HD quality, something they'd all probably regret later. Sarah had already retreated to the periphery of the growing crowd, pretending to be deeply fascinated by her phone's weather app, though her reddening cheeks betrayed her embarrassment. Mike stood rooted to his spot, watching the scene unfold with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a slow-motion train wreck. "I bet these guys failed clown school," Jake announced to his growing audience, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "That's why they had to become guards instead. No sense of humor required." He punctuated this with an exaggerated wink at the younger guard, whose stoic expression remained unchanged. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip gathered nearby, pointing and giggling as Jake launched into an even more theatrical display. Their teacher tried unsuccessfully to hurry them along, muttering something about inappropriate behavior and setting a bad example. But Jake was beyond caring about being a good example. He was putting on what he considered the performance of his life. He began incorporating exaggerated rolling movements, each one bringing him closer to the guard's position. The cobblestones were definitely leaving bruises now, but he was too committed to his cause to care. His shirt was collecting dust and grime from the ground, and his carefully styled hair was becoming increasingly disheveled. "I suppose if I were wearing one of those fancy hats, I'd be important enough to help," Jake called out, his voice dripping with an atrocious attempt at a British accent. "I say, good chaps, quite rude to ignore a chap in distress, what?" His terrible impression drew scattered laughter from the crowd, encouraging him further. An elderly British woman in a perfectly pressed tweed suit clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "Young man, you're making an absolute spectacle of yourself," she announced with the kind of aristocratic disdain that only decades of proper British upbringing could perfect. But Jake was beyond caring about proper decorum, or the opinions of disapproving onlookers. He switched tactics, adopting an exaggerated military pose while still lying on the ground. "Attention! Emergency situation detected! But must maintain straight face!" He contorted his features into an over-the-top serious expression, drawing more laughs from the younger tourists in the crowd while the older ones shook their heads in disapproval. The guards remained absolutely motionless, their discipline unwavering. This only spurred Jake to greater heights of ridiculousness. He began a running commentary on their stoicism, his voice growing louder with each passing moment, taking on the tone of a nature documentary narrator. "Ladies and gentlemen, witness the famous royal guards in their natural habitat," he announced in his best David Attenborough impression, which was possibly even worse than his standard British accent. "Notice their remarkable ability to ignore basic human empathy. Scientists believe they're actually robots powered by tea and crumpets." Some teenagers in the crowd had their phones out now, recording the spectacle. One of them was live-streaming the whole thing on TikTok, which only fueled Jake's determination to make this performance memorable. His actions grew increasingly bold, each movement more exaggerated than the last. "I bet you guys practice this in front of the mirror every morning," he taunted, striking a rigid pose. "No smiling allowed in the Guard Academy. Must maintain perfect poker face at all times. Do they make you watch comedy shows as endurance training? Or maybe you just have to stand there while someone tickles you with a feather duster?" A young American tourist whispered to her friend. "Should we be recording this?" It feels kind of wrong. Are you kidding? This is going viral for sure, her friend replied, adjusting her camera angle. My followers are going to love this. Jake was now fully committed to his role as provocateur, his initial plan of faking injury completely abandoned in favor of outright mockery. He marched in place, swinging his arms in an exaggerated fashion, his movements becoming more elaborate with each passing moment. Look at me, I'm a royal guard, he proclaimed, puffing out his chest. I've got a fluffy hat and no sense of humor. I probably sleep standing up and dream about standing still. Do you guys ever play musical statues? I bet you're unbeatable at that game. The crowd's reaction had shifted from entertainment to secondhand embarrassment, but Jake mistook their continued attention for encouragement. He was so caught up in his escalating performance that he failed to notice the subtle changes happening around him, too focused on his own theatrical display to read the room. The atmosphere had begun to shift, like the pressure drop before a thunderstorm. Tourists at the edges of the crowd were turning their heads, their expressions changing from amusement to something else entirely. A few steps behind Jake, a shadow had begun to materialize, a presence that moved with deliberate, military precision. But Jake, intoxicated by his own theatrics, noticed none of this. He was too busy planning his grand finale, completely oblivious to the fact that his audience had stopped watching him and was now focused on something, or someone, else entirely. His moment of triumph was about to transform into something very different from what he'd imagined, and the viral video he'd hoped to create was about to take an unexpected turn that would make him wish he never attempted this stunt in the first place. The first sign that something had changed was the sudden silence. Like a wave receding before a tsunami, the crowd's scattered laughter died in their throats, replaced by an eerie quiet that Jake, in his theatrical fervor, failed to notice. The atmosphere shifted as if someone had suddenly dimmed the sun, casting an invisible shadow over the entire courtyard. 10 feet behind Jake, emerging from a hidden side entrance with the fluid grace of a predator, stood another royal guard. Unlike his motionless colleagues at their posts, this one moved with purposeful intent. His polished boots made no sound on the ancient cobblestones, his approach as silent as gathering storm clouds. The ceremonial uniform, far from looking decorative, now emanated an aura of authority that made several tourists instinctively step backward. Sarah was the first of Jake's friends to notice. The color drained from her face as she spotted the approaching guard, his bearing making it clear this was no ceremonial figure but an active duty soldier. She tried to catch Jake's attention with frantic hand gestures, but he was too engrossed in his performance to notice her warning signals. Mike, seeing Sarah's reaction, turned and froze. The approaching guard was easily 6'4", his muscular frame filling out the red uniform in a way that suggested years of military training rather than parade ground practice. The bearskin hat added another foot to his already imposing height, creating a silhouette that seemed to blot out the afternoon sun. Tom's phone wavered as he captured the guard's approach, his filming hand trembling slightly. This wasn't the viral content Jake had been hoping for. It was something far more intense. The guard moved with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested extensive combat training, each step measured and purposeful. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear path between the approaching guard and his oblivious target. Parents pulled their children closer, teens lowered their phones, and the elderly British woman who had been disapproving of Jake's behavior now watched with something akin to satisfaction in her eyes. The guard's face was a study in controlled authority. Unlike the expressionless masks of the stationary guards, his features held a focused intensity that spoke of years of discipline and command. His eyes, sharp and alert, were fixed on Jake with laser-like precision. There was no anger in his gaze, just a calm, professional assessment that somehow made it even more intimidating. Time seemed to slow down as the guard closed the distance. Tourists who had been recording Jake's antics now shifted their cameras to capture this new development, sensing they were about to witness something far more memorable than a tourist's failed attempt at humor. Jake remained blissfully unaware of the approaching figure, still caught up in his performance. But something in the atmosphere finally penetrated his self-absorbed bubble. Perhaps it was the way the light changed as the guard's shadow fell across him, Or maybe it was the prickle on the back of his neck, that primordial instinct that tells you when you're being watched by a predator. The sensation crept over him gradually, like ice water trickling down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his theatrical movements began to slow. Something had changed, but his brain hadn't quite caught up with what his instincts were screaming at him. The guard stopped precisely 3 feet behind Jake, his shadow now fully engulfing the prone tourist. The silence in the courtyard was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of London traffic and the nervous shuffling of feet as tourists waited to see what would happen next. Jake's performance finally stuttered to a halt as he registered the change in his audience. They weren't looking at him anymore, their eyes were fixed on something behind him, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and second-hand embarrassment. Even his friends' faces had transformed, Sarah's horrified expression, Mike's wide-eyed stare, and Tom's shaking camera all pointed to something significant happening behind him. The cold weight of realization settled in Jake's stomach like a lead ball. The crowd's attention had shifted, the atmosphere had changed, and there was definitely someone standing behind him. Every movie he'd ever watched, every instinct he possessed told him not to turn around, but his body was already moving, his neck craning slowly to look over his shoulder. His eyes traveled upward, past the perfectly polished boots, along the crisp red uniform, over the gleaming brass buttons, until finally reaching the face of the guard who had been watching his entire performance. The guard's expression wasn't angry or amused, it was something far more unnerving, the calm, measured look of someone who had seen every moment of his foolish display and was about to ensure it would never happen again. Jake's throat went dry. The clever commentary and theatrical bravado that had flowed so freely moments ago evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. He found himself caught in the guard's steady gaze, suddenly very aware of how ridiculous he must look sprawled on the ground in his dirty clothes, all his earlier confidence draining away like water through a sieve. The guard hadn't said a word yet, hadn't moved a muscle since taking his position. He didn't need to. His presence alone had transformed the entire scene from a tourist's prank into something else entirely. A moment of reckoning that Jake suddenly realized he was completely unprepared for. Time crystallized in the courtyard as the royal guard took one deliberate step forward, his boot meeting the cobblestones with a sound that seemed to echo through the silence. The afternoon sun caught the brass buttons of his uniform, sending sharp glints of light across Jake's upturned face. The guard's movement, though minimal, carried the weight of years of military discipline and authority. "Get up! Now!" The words cut through the air like a steel blade, quiet, precise, and brooking no argument. The guard's voice was level, almost conversational, but it carried an unmistakable edge of command that made it clear this wasn't a request. His British accent, unlike Jake's earlier mockery, was authentic and carried the crisp pronunciation of someone used to giving orders that were immediately obeyed. Jake's mind raced through a catalogue of possible responses. All his earlier bravado, his carefully planned witty remarks, evaporated under the guard's steady gaze. His mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water, but no sound emerged. The cobblestones beneath him suddenly felt very hard and uncomfortable, but his limbs seemed to have forgotten how to work. I was just... Jake's voice emerged as a croak, a far cry from his earlier theatrical projections. His hands, which had been so expressive during his performance, now trembled slightly as he pressed them against the ground. The guard took another step forward, his shadow completely enveloping Jake. That wasn't a suggestion. Each word was measured, delivered with the kind of authority that suggested consequences would follow if not heeded immediately. In the crowd, Tom's phone continued recording, capturing every excruciating moment. Sarah had her hands clasped over her mouth, while Mike stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination. The other tourists remained silent, forming a perfect circle around the unfolding drama, their own cameras lowered out of respect, or fear. Jake scrambled to his feet, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, a stark contrast to his earlier theatrical performance. His shoes slipped slightly on the smooth stones, and he had to windmill his arms to maintain balance. As he straightened up, he found himself face to chest with the guard, having to tilt his head back to meet the man's gaze. "I was just joking, mate." Jake attempted a smile that came out more like a nervous grimace. "You know, having a bit of fun with the whole tradition thing." His voice trailed off as the guard's expression remained unchanged, those steady eyes boring into him with the intensity of a laser. The guard shifted his weight slightly, a movement so subtle it was barely noticeable, yet it caused Jake to take an involuntary step backward. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. "Fun?" The guard's single word carried the weight of centuries of tradition. "You find it amusing to mock the Sovereign's Guard? To disrespect a position of honor that men have died defending?" Each question was delivered with precision, each word carefully chosen and weighted. Jake's face, already pale, lost what little color remained. The reality of his situation was crashing down around him like a house of cards. This wasn't some mall cop or theme park character. This was a trained soldier, someone who had earned the right to wear that uniform through years of dedication and discipline. "The guards you were so eager to provoke?" The soldier continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Jake to lean in slightly to hear him. "They're decorated combat veterans. The funny hat you mocked? It represents 200 years of service to the crown. That theatrical stance you imitated? It's a position of respect, maintained through hours of discipline that you clearly know nothing about." A bead of sweat rolled down Jake's temple despite the cool afternoon air. His earlier audience, who had laughed at his antics, now watched in uncomfortable silence as he received this dressing down. Some looked away, unable to bear the second-hand embarrassment, while others couldn't tear their eyes from the scene. "I didn't mean any disrespect," Jake began, but the guard cut him off with a slight raise of his eyebrow, a movement so minimal yet so effective that Jake's words died in his throat. "Every day," the guard continued, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "we welcome thousands of visitors from around the world. They come to witness tradition, to respect history, to honor what these grounds represent." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And then there are those who come to mock, to disrupt, to turn ceremony into circus. Which are you?" The question hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His earlier confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a painful awareness of his own foolishness. His phone, still in his pocket recording what he'd hoped would be his viral moment, now felt like it was burning against his leg. "I was just joking, mate." Jake's voice cracked as he stammered out the excuse, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. His earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a crushing awareness of his foolishness. The guard's unwavering presence made him feel like a schoolboy caught misbehaving, except this wasn't a teacher he could charm with a quick excuse or an easy smile. The guard took another measured step forward, his boots clicking against the cobblestones with military precision. The sound seemed to echo through the courtyard, each click another nail in the coffin of Jake's dignity. The crowd watched in complete silence, phones lowered, the only sound the distant hum of London traffic and the soft rustle of wind through the nearby trees. Tom's camera had stopped shaking. He held it steady now, capturing what he realized was a moment his friend would never forget, though perhaps not for the reasons Jake had originally hoped. Sarah and Mike had drawn closer together, watching with a mixture of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment as their friend's grand plan crumbled before their eyes. Jake took an instinctive step backward, his heel catching on the uneven cobblestones. He stumbled slightly, his usual coordination deserting him under the guard's stern gaze. The contrast between his earlier theatrical falls and this genuine moment of gracelessness wasn't lost on the watching crowd. "The exit," the guard spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who never needed to shout to be obeyed. "Is that way?" He made a minimal gesture with his chin, the movement so slight it was barely perceptible, yet it carried the weight of an imperial decree. Jake's feet began moving before his brain had fully processed the command. His body seemed to understand something his mind was still struggling to accept, that this was one situation he couldn't talk or joke his way out of. Each step backward felt like moving through molasses, his legs heavy with the weight of his humiliation. An elderly British woman in the crowd, the same one who had earlier criticized his behavior, spoke just loud enough to be heard. "Well, I suppose some lessons must be learned the hard way." Her crisp accent carried a hint of satisfaction that made Jake's cheeks burn even hotter. As he retreated, the two guards he had spent so long trying to provoke remained at their posts, as immobile as statues, as if the entire incident had been nothing but a ripple in the pond of their eternal vigilance. Their discipline, which Jake had mocked so thoroughly, now seemed less like rigidity and more like an unshakable strength. The crowd began to part, creating a clear path for Jake's retreat. Parents who had earlier pulled their children away now used the moment as an impromptu teaching opportunity. "And that's why we respect the guards," one mother whispered to her wide-eyed son, who nodded solemnly, clutching his toy soldier a little tighter. Jake's friends fell in step behind him, a quiet procession of shared embarrassment. Tom's camera was still rolling, though now pointed at the ground, capturing only the sound of their footsteps on the ancient stones. Sarah reached out to pat Jake's shoulder but thought better of it, letting her hand fall back to her side. Some moments of humiliation were best processed alone. As they neared the exit, another tourist in the crowd, a young man with an Australian accent, whispered to his companion just loud enough for Jake to hear. "Guess they do react, just not the way he expected." The comment drew a few knowing chuckles from those nearby, each laugh another pin in the balloon of Jake's deflated ego. The guard hadn't moved from his position, but his presence seemed to fill the entire courtyard, a silent reminder of the authority and tradition that Jake had so carelessly mocked. The afternoon sun caught the brass buttons of his uniform one last time, sending sharp glints of light that seemed to follow Jake like spotlight of shame. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, intending to stop his own recording. The screen showed that it had been running the entire time, capturing every excruciating moment of his humiliation. What he had hoped would be his viral claim to fame had instead become a documentation of the most embarrassing moment of his life. As they passed through the gates, the bustling sounds of London traffic seemed to break the spell. Jake finally dared to glance back over his shoulder. The guard had already resumed his position, as if nothing had happened, the only indication of the incident being the slightly larger gap the tourists now maintained around the guard posts. "So," Mike ventured after they'd walked half a block in complete silence, "I'm guessing we're skipping the Tower of London tour tomorrow?" Jake couldn't even muster a response. His mind was already racing through all the social media posts he'd have to delete, his earlier boasts about showing those guards what real entertainment looks like, now reading like premature epitaphs to his dignity. Later that evening, as clips of the incident began circulating on social media, they didn't show what Jake had hoped they would. Instead of a triumphant prankster making the guards break character, they showed something else entirely, a moment of perfect contrast between foolish disrespect and unwavering dignity. The comments weren't laughing with him, they were nodding in appreciation of a lesson well taught. The next morning, a new group of tourists would gather in that same courtyard, phones ready to capture their own memories of the famous guards. But now and then, someone would whisper the story of the tourist who learned the hard way that some traditions command respect not through force, but through the quiet strength of unwavering discipline. And if that tourist happened to be watching these videos from his hotel room, nursing both his bruised ego and the very real bruises from his theatrical falls, well, that was a different kind of viral fame altogether.